Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to do a comparison of a scene, book to movie, that seems kind of a small scene and not that important, but I think it actually is very interesting to compare, and it's from The Return of the King. It's where the hosts of the West come to the Black Gate, and they encounter the Mouth of Sauron. Now, you'll see why I think this is interesting in a minute, but it's a fairly short scene. If you've seen the movie, now in the movie I think it's only in the extended cut, if I remember correctly. It's been so long since I've seen the original theatrical cut for the Peter Jackson movies. I really don't remember what all is original and what's extended, but I'm fairly certain the Mouth of Sauron sequence is only in the extended cut. So if you haven't seen that, I will kind of explain what happens in the scene, and then I'll compare it to what happens in the novel, and I'll discuss kind of why those differences are important. So let's get going. So in Peter Jackson's movie, what we get is Aragorn, Éomer, Merry, Pippin, Gandalf, and Legolas and Gimli, and maybe one or two other regular Gondor soldiers ride up to the gate, and Aragorn basically says, "Let the Lord of the Black Land come forth, let justice be done upon him." They sit there for a minute, nothing happens, and then the gate opens. And then out comes this one guy on a black horse with this ridiculously large helmet, and he comes out, and the first thing he says is, "My master Sauron the Great bids thee welcome." And then he gives this really atrociously ugly smile. And if you watch the appendices materials in Peter Jackson's movies, they actually explain kind of how they did like a Photoshop edit sort of thing to make his mouth even bigger than it is. The guy already has like kind of a large mouth, but it's kind of an off-putting part of this scene to me. They overplayed the disgustingness of this character to me, but that's really not relevant to my point. I just wanted to mention that. So he says that, looks around, everybody kind of has this awkward silence for a moment, and then he says, "Is there anyone in this route with authority to treat with me?" Gandalf then says, "We don't come to treat with Sauron, who is faithless and accursed." He basically says, Sauron has to go and never come back. And then he says, old graybeard, I have a token I was bidden to show. I'm skipping some of the dialogue for brevity, but he says, "I have a token I was bidden to show thee." He brings up Frodo's mithril coat and throws it to Gandalf. Of course, everybody's getting upset, Pippin and Merry especially, and Gandalf's trying to keep them quiet. And then the Mouth of Sauron says, "So the Hobbit was dear to thee, I see." Pay attention to the these and thous. That's actually important. I'll get to that later. And so he says several different things, but he, basically is trying to make Gandalf feel real guilty for sending Frodo and make him think that he's dead. Of course, we know he's not at this point in the movie. But at any rate, he's, bringing all this up. And there's really not a whole lot of back and forth there. So at some point, then everybody gets kind of quiet. They're melancholy. Aragorn then rides up, and then the Mouth of Sauron says, "And who is this? Isildur's heir? It takes more to make a king than a broken elvish blade." And then Aragorn just suddenly sweeps out his sword and cuts off the Mouth of Sauron's head, which seems kind of an underhanded thing to do in the situation. But at any rate, Aragorn then just says, "I don't believe it, I will not," meaning Frodo is dead. So that's kind of the key elements of the scene in Peter Jackson's movie. Now let's look at how Tolkien does this. So in the novel, one of the things we have to remember, because of the way Tolkien breaks up the story, he hasn't actually talked about anything with Frodo and Sam yet in The Return of the King. The last thing we knew about them was Frodo had been taken by orcs, and Sam had, been trying to follow them, and then they closed a gate right in his face, basically, and he fell unconscious. We don't actually know what the status of Frodo and Sam is when we read the novel. So right off the bat, there's a very different dynamic going on, because we as the reader, who are in some sense omniscient, aren't omniscient as to this. Whereas in the movie, we do know already that Frodo and Sam are fine. We already know that. In the book, you don't know that. And that's a key background piece of information for how this scene goes down. Now, when the Black Gate actually opens in the novel, it's kind of the same start. They have a herald basically say some stuff. The Black Gate opens. The Mouth of Sauron comes out with some other people. It's like several different people. Tolkien just calls it an embassy, which implies more than one person. It may not actually say that there's more than one person, but it implies it at least. So he comes out and he doesn't start off with "My master bids thee welcome," because why would you do that? It doesn't even really make sense. Everybody knows that they're total enemies. But anyway, he starts off with the line, "Is there any in this route with authority to treat with me, or indeed with wit to understand me?" And then he looks at Aragorn and says, "Not thou, at least. It takes more to make a king than a bit of elvish glass or a rabble such as this. Any brigand of the hills could do as well." At this point, there is a silence. Aragorn is basically eyeing the Mouth of Sauron, staring him face to face. And after a while, nobody makes a move, but then the Mouth of Sauron just kind of flinches and suddenly says, "I am an ambassador, I cannot be harmed." And this is why that whole thing with Aragorn chopping off his head in the movie is a little underhanded. Remember, they are kind of at a white flag type of situation. This is a parlay. But anyway, Gandalf pipes in and says, "Where such customs hold, it is also the custom to use less insolence." So he's, kind of directly saying, look, you kind of started the downhill slide by insulting Aragorn and all that. So don't try to play that card. So anyway, the progression then goes on. You get some of the same material. He brings up the mithril coat. He also brings up, I think, Sam's sword and an elven cloak. There's more than just the mithril coat. And you do get some of the same reactions. Merry's not actually there. Merry is still in the Houses of Healing in Gondor. But Pippin is, very visibly upset. Gandalf is trying to calm them down. And then we get a little conversation between Gandalf and the Mouth of Sauron. So there is a lot more dialogue that goes on. There's the Mouth of Sauron talks about there being a conspiracy because there's a elven cloak, there's a Numenorian blade, there's all this. He basically goes on like you're all kind of conspiring against Sauron, who is obviously the rightful lord here, whatever. But anyway, it all comes down to a point where Pippin, of course, is upset and he notices this and he says, "The halfling was dear to thee, I see, or else his errand was one that you did not wish to fail." It has. And then he basically says, if you don't accede to our terms, he's going to be tormented basically until he dies, and it's going to be a slow torment, so it'll be a long one. And so Gandalf says, "Name the terms." And the narrator tells us that even though he says this steadily, you can tell that there's anguish in his face, and everybody's assuming he's probably going to accept the terms. Now, that's pretty powerful stuff because the terms aren't going to be good. And the Mouth of Sauron, of course, starts in with the terms, and the terms are basically the armies have to disband. Orthanc is going to become his own, Sauron's own, and he gives the impression that the Mouth of Sauron is going to be the one that kind of rules it, and that Gondor and Rohan are going to become tributaries to Mordor and all this other stuff. Gandalf then basically says, "Your terms we reject. We'll take these tokens, the mithril coat and all that," and he basically just takes them from the Mouth of Sauron by force. He never actually threw it at Gandalf in the book. He just kind of showed him. So he takes those and he says, "We reject your terms utterly," and that kind of wraps up the main part of what goes on between them. Actually, I should also mention here, and this is somewhat relevant, but I don't think it's really necessary. Gandalf says, after the delivery of the terms, he says, "This is a lot to ask for one guy. Can you actually show us that you have him?" And the Mouth of Sauron, not having any way to call his bluff, basically bluffs again and basically says, "You want surety, you're not going to get any. You just have to take the terms or leave them. And that's when Gandalf basically says, these we will take, meaning the mithril coat and everything else. So that's what really brings the whole conversation to an end. Now let's do an analysis of why the differences here are important. Okay, so remember, as a background in the novel, we don't know what's happened to Frodo and Sam. What we do know is that Frodo was not carrying Sam's sword. Well, we know he had Sam's sword by the end because Sam laid his sword by him and then took Sting for himself. But what the rest of the characters know is that Frodo had Sting, not a Númenórean sword from the Barrow Downs. So right there's your first clue that something is slightly amiss. Then, of course, when the Mouth of Sauron says, or else his errand was one that you did not wish to fail, that's interesting because it implies he doesn't know what the errand was, which implies he hasn't found the ring. So putting these two things together, you can kind of get the idea that Gandalf has figured out in his mind Frodo or Sam has been captured, probably Frodo because it's the mithril coat that he has, but the ring has not been found, which implies the other, which in this case would be Sam, has not been captured, which means the errand has not necessarily failed. This is really important because you can see, from the reader's perspective, if it's the first time you're really going through the story, it looks kind of bad that Gandalf kind of just throws Frodo's fate to the wind. And importantly, I think it is true that Gandalf really probably does fear for Frodo in this particular instance. It does say that his face was anguished. Whether that was a put on for the Mouth of Sauron is another question. Probably he did believe that Frodo had been captured and really was in danger of being tormented for who knows how long until he died. But he knows that the quest is still at least potentially, viable. And so he's not willing to surrender all of Middle Earth just to save Frodo, painful as that decision is. But of course, the other thing is, even from Gandalf's perspective, even if he thinks that Frodo probably is captured, he's also looking at it going, well, he already knows that the errand probably hasn't failed, because if it had, we probably wouldn't be treating here in the first place. Sauron would have just come out and crushed everybody. He would have had the ring. There'd be no real chance left. Why even bother negotiating? Sauron doesn't care if he loses a few orcs or, Haradrim or Easterlings on the battlefield. He really doesn't care. He's negotiating because he knows he doesn't have a sure victory. And Gandalf kind of makes that point in the conversation too. He also knows that if the errand hasn't failed, that the Mouth of Sauron is lying to some extent, and so if he's lying to some extent, maybe Frodo's not there. So he may be making a gamble in this particular case, but he's making a solid gamble. And to come back to that whole thee and thou thing, I meant to reference this earlier, but I just remembered it. The thee and thou language, if you actually know your historical usage of thee and thou versus you and ye, the th versions of the words are a more familiar, or in this particular case, contemptuous use of language than the you or ye. You would be a more formal, I'm talking to you as at least an equal, and in some sense maybe a superior. It would be kind of like using Mr. as opposed to just a shortened first name. So that is relevant because you definitely do get the idea that the Mouth of Sauron is just talking down to them the entire time. And Gandalf is, in some sense, remarkably patient with him in that regard. But the main thing here is Gandalf is putting together pieces of information that he has that this Mouth of Sauron doesn't have. And he actually says, I know the history of these things. I know all about the items that you've shown me, and you don't. And there you kind of get a clue that he's actually trying to get him the idea that I know more than you do. You're bluffing. Maybe that's not exactly what he means, but it's certainly one way to interpret it. And so at any rate, Gandalf does make the gamble. He basically, he knows he's probably at least putting Frodo's life at risk because there's no way to know that Frodo isn't captured. but he at least has a pretty good idea that one hobbit is still out there with the ring trying to reach Mount Doom. And since that's really at the end of the day the main thing they're going for, you get the idea that he's hoping, probably against hope, that the quest succeeds and that even if Frodo is captured, they can then rescue him after the ring is destroyed. So it's interesting because the way the scene plays out in the Return of the King novel definitely gives you a lot different view, because you don't know going into it what's happened to Frodo. You just know that he was taken by orcs. So in your own mind, you're thinking, this really is probably bad. On the other hand, if you're really paying attention and putting the pieces together like Gandalf seems to be doing, you can reach the conclusion that there's something fishy going on here. And of course, the other thing for the reader, which is a little bit of a cheat compared to Gandalf, we're expecting a good ending to the story, right? I mean, we all kind of know going in that's what we're probably going to get. This is the man who wrote The Hobbit, which had a pretty happy ending for the most part. So it may end up that, maybe Frodo has died, but he's not going to be tormented forever, or, somehow or other, the ending may be bittersweet, but it's not going to be just devastatingly horrible, because the guy who wrote The Hobbit wouldn't do that, presumably. So, but from the reader's perspective, if you're thinking about what's going on and you really pay attention, you can see what Gandalf is doing in this scene and why he's making the choices that he's making. And I think it's really interesting to kind of analyze how all that flows through. In the movie, you lose all of that, calculation, because we already know Frodo and Sam are alive. You don't get any idea that Gandalf has any real hope necessarily for any of this. It's Aragorn who kind of breaks the tension, and he just refuses to believe it. Why? We don't know. And I mean, we never really get an explanation of Gandalf's actions in the book either, but if you're paying attention, you can at least, because of the dialogue and because of what he says, you get the idea that he actually is thinking about the implications and going, okay, he said this, that means he probably doesn't know this, and I know this, and yeah, okay. So you get the idea that he really is thinking it through and reaching a solid conclusion, not just going off of, hope against hope by itself. So anyway, I've kind of beat that horse to death now, so I'll go ahead and leave it there. So there's my comparison of the Black Gate open scene between the novel and Peter Jackson's movie. It's one of those that I really wish I had read the novel before I originally saw the Rankin Bass Return of the King animated movie, and so I already knew the outcome, of course. But I wish that I had read the novel beforehand and really gotten to experience what that would be like before, knowing how it all turns out in the end. I'd be curious to know what my thought process would be. Looking back at it, you can guess at Gandalf's, but what would the reader think encountering that for the first time ever? Hard to say for me. But anyway, if you enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up. Please do share it around. If you want more comparisons between the book and the movie, or more stuff about, Middle-earth in general, or more stuff about Tolkien, even if not related to Middle-earth, you could subscribe to the channel, or you can follow me at JRRT Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.